Welcome, fellow seekers of forgotten tales, to a journey through a world veiled in silence and cloaked in devotion. Wherever you find yourself tonight, beneath the silver glow of city lights, adrift on quiet countryside roads, or nestled in the comfort of your own home, I invite you to leave behind the noise of the present and join me in stepping through the weathered doors of an ancient world. Before we begin, take a deep breath, allow your thoughts to quiet, and imagine the distant sound of bells tolling across the mist-laden hills of medieval Europe. We stand now before the crimson cloister of Saint Ethelreda, a forgotten convent carved into the hillside of a land untouched by time. It is the year 1178, an age of flickering candlelight, iron-bound prayer books, and whispered fears of divine judgment. The heavy wooden doors groan open, revealing a world cut off from the restless march of kings and armies. Within these stone walls, no worldly ambition holds sway. No market cries pierce the air, and no man's voice dares trespass. This is a world ruled by silence, submission, and the iron will of the abbess, whose authority is second only to the will of God. Step forward, dear traveler. The air grows colder, thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient incense. Shadows twist along the granite corridors, dancing to the rhythm of distant chants. Each step echoes like a drumbeat through the hollow halls, through spaces where hundreds of feet have walked before you, some in faith, others in fear. Tonight, we follow the quiet footsteps of Sister Adela, a young novice who crossed these gates scarcely 6 months ago. Born the youngest daughter of a struggling knight, Adela's path was chosen for her long before her heart could protest. Her dowry, too meager for a respectable marriage, found its way instead to the coffers of Saint Ethelreda, and in exchange, her life was traded for an eternity of service behind these cloistered walls. At first, there had been a strange beauty to it all. The soaring chapel ceilings, painted with ancient saints staring down in muted judgment, the smooth rhythm of the daily prayers, and the disciplined harmony of communal life. It had seemed to her like the gates of heaven itself, but beneath, the sacred rituals and whispered devotions lurked a life harsher than any peasant's toil, more grueling than any knight's campaign. The clang of the iron bell splits the quiet night air. It is the hour of nocturnes, midnight prayer. There is no sleep to be found here, no softness in the convent's rhythm. Each sister rises from her straw-stuffed pallet, their shivering forms gathering like specters in the darkness. Bare feet slap against cold stone floors, rough woolen habits scratch against pale skin. There is no speaking, only the relentless movement toward the chapel, where they will chant until dawn threatens the horizon. Sister Adela's body aches from the punishing fasts that reduce her meals to little more than thin broth and stale crusts. Her stomach knots painfully, a constant reminder that here, comfort is the first enemy to be defeated. Hunger is not a hardship, but a test of holiness. Those who embrace it are promised crowns in heaven. Those who falter are scorned as weak vessels of sin. As the sisters file into their wooden stalls, the chapel flickers to life beneath the glow of guttering candles. The ancient chants rise, low and solemn, bouncing from stone wall to stone wall. Like the voices of the dead, Adela's lips move mechanically, her voice swallowed by the tide of prayer. But her mind drifts in the hush of the cloister. Silence is both shield and shackle. Speaking is a forbidden indulgence, granted only in brief moments of confession or obedience. Each thought is trapped within the confines of one's own mind, festering and growing until even the sound of your own breath feels like rebellion. Days are divided by rigid hours of prayer. 7 in total, from the first light of dawn until the blackest hour of night. Between prayers, toil becomes worship. Adela spends her mornings bent over brittle parchments in the cold scriptorium, her young fingers cracking from ink and chill as she copies ancient scriptures line by agonizing line. The abbess calls it holy labor, but the body knows only pain. Afternoons are claimed by the convent gardens, where sisters dig into the frozen earth with bare hands, coaxing life from reluctant soil. Others toil in the kitchens, stirring vast iron pots of watery porridge, or in the infirmary, tending to wounds they scarcely know how to treat. Every task is sacred, every hardship a step toward salvation, or so they are told. But salvation is a promise that seems forever distant to Adela. She has watched elder sisters, gaunt and hollow-eyed, shuffle through these halls like the walking dead. She has heard the desperate sobs muffled behind thick stone walls, seen the lash marks that peek from beneath fraying sleeves. The convent is a fortress of piety, but it is also a prison of silent suffering. Punishment here is meted out, not in fits of rage, but with chilling precision. The rule of Saint Benedict governs all, enforced by the abbess with merciless devotion. The slightest misstep, a slip of the tongue, a missed prayer, a moment of idle thought, invites penance. Public humiliation, prolonged fasting, isolation in the cold cellars where darkness suffocates the spirit. Adela learned this early, when a single whispered question earned her a night in the punishment cell, a windowless vault where the silence presses like a weight upon the chest, and the mind plays cruel tricks. Her fingers still bear the scars from that night, claw marks from when her own desperation drove her to scratch at the walls, seeking escape where there was none. There are others, older sisters, whose bodies bear the cost of decades within these walls. Sister Clarice, once renowned for her singing voice, now rendered mute by years of enforced silence. Sister Rosamond, who walks with a permanent stoop from endless hours of kneeling and penitential prayer. Sister Magdalene, whose skin blooms with angry sores from self-inflicted lashes, a body offered to God, bruised and broken. The abbess herself moves among them like a living statue, her face carved from stone, her gaze sharp enough to wound. Her devotion is a blade honed to perfection, and beneath her command, no weakness is allowed to fester. She calls it love, a brutal love that breaks the flesh to save the soul. Night bleeds into day, as the convent stirs again. The clang of the morning bell summons the sisters to prime, the first prayer of the day. Adela's knees crack as she rises from the stone floor, joints stiff and swollen. She joins the procession moving through the cloister, heads bowed beneath the weight of unrelenting expectation. Today, like every day, brings no solace. The convent's small kitchen prepares its ration of boiled roots and bread so hard it splinters teeth. The sisters eat in silence, the only sound the scrape of wooden spoons against worn bowls. There is no comfort in the food, no warmth in the fellowship, only the ceaseless march of hours, the tightening noose of devotion. Outside, the world shifts through seasons unnoticed. Feast days and market fairs unfold in distant villages. Marriages are made, children born, old friends pass into the grave, but the sisters of Saint Ethelreda remain frozen in time, locked within walls older than memory itself. And yet, despite the hardship, there lingers a fragile thread of something unspoken, something that stirs within Adela's weary heart. Perhaps it is stubborn hope, perhaps the last flicker of youthful rebellion, or perhaps it is the distant echo of a world beyond these walls, a life not yet fully surrendered. The convent clock strikes again, its toll resonating through the ancient corridors. Another hour passes, another step taken along the narrow path of sanctity and suffering. But in the hidden corners of the cloister, behind the thick walls where light scarcely reaches, secrets breathe. Whispers travel like shadows, unnoticed but ever present. And as Adela returns to her assigned toil, a gloved hand presses a scrap of parchment into her palm, words written in haste, forbidden yet irresistible. Her pulse quickens. The crimson cloister holds many secrets, some buried beneath centuries of devotion, others stirring now in the hearts of those who still remember the world beyond the convent walls. And so, beneath the hollow chants and unrelenting silence, something begins to shift, something ancient, something dangerous, something that will awaken with the toll of the next bell. The bells of Saint Ethelreda rang once more, though this time the sound seemed to tremble through the ancient stones, less a call to prayer, and more a warning whispered through the very marrow of the cloister. The late afternoon sky had dulled to a melancholy gray, clouds sagging over the convent's ancient walls, pressing down like the weight of centuries upon every soul within. The tolling echoed in the corridors as Sister Adela and her companions moved like restless shadows. Their steps hurried, but heads bowed low, minds entangled in a quiet storm of secrets that no vow of silence could suppress. Beneath the familiar motions of routine, a tide was turning. Whispers that had long been kept hidden were finding breath again. memories of life before the cloister that refused to fade quietly into the stone. Adela felt it in every hurried glance exchanged beneath cowls, every clandestine touch of fingertips over parchment, every feverish whisper that had begun to ripple through the convent like wind through dry leaves. The appointed task of the day should have been simple tending to the dwindling herb garden and preparing for the arrival of Father Clement, the abbot's chosen messenger. Yet the soil felt heavy beneath Adela's nails, the air strangely charged, as if the earth itself sensed the currents shifting within these sacred walls. Sister Beatrice worked beside her, fingers nimble as she uprooted the withered stalks, but her jaw was set tighter than usual, her silence stretched taut. Adela glanced sideways, careful to avoid the watchful eye of Sister Laurentine patrolling the periphery. Then, with the faintest nod, toward the chapel's rear entrance, Beatrice gave the signal that had been agreed upon in hurried, forbidden exchanges. The courtyard was quieter than it had been in months. The novices had been sent to the lower fields, the elder sisters confined to their evening preparations. It was the closest to privacy any of them could hope to find. Adela's heart beat steadily, but her hands trembled as they finished gathering the useless bundle of herbs, and made their way into the chapel through the rear cloister arch. Within the candlelit chamber, the statues stared down in their unmoving silence, carved saints frozen in their timeless vigil. But Adela's focus remained fixed on the floorboards near the altar, one loose plank where Beatrice had secreted the hidden parchment from Sister Magdalene just 3 nights prior. They moved quickly, retrieving the document and tucking it away beneath the folds of their habit, careful to leave no trace of their trespass. By the time Father Clement's procession arrived, the convent was cloaked in an unnatural hush. The sisters lined the cloister corridors, heads bowed as the robed figure passed, his presence commanding but his expression as cold as the autumn wind. Adela stood among them, shoulders stiff, forcing the rhythms of obedience into her posture, even as her mind throbbed with anticipation. Father Clement's purpose was no mystery to those who had dwelt long within the cloister. He came as both messenger and executioner, delivering the abbess's directives and ensuring their brutal fulfillment. Whispers spoke of his hand in the recent disappearances of Sister Felice and Sister Honora, both removed quietly, their fates sealed within the abbess's cruel decree. As Clement passed, Adela felt the weight of his stare, his gaze lingering too long upon her countenance before moving on. She forced herself to remain unmoved, the lines of her face schooled into submission, the storm within buried just beneath the surface. When the evening bell tolled, the sisters gathered in the refectory, for their meager meal of coarse bread and weak broth. Yet every glance, every lowered eye, every bite swallowed without savor, carried an undertone of mounting rebellion. Adela's fingers grazed the edge of the hidden parchment beneath her robes, the crumpled texture a constant reminder of what was now set into motion. Night fell, the convent swallowed by the slow descent of darkness, but sleep remained elusive. Sister Adela lay upon her straw pallet, eyes fixed upon the cracked ceiling above, listening as the wind howled beyond the thick walls. Across the chamber, Sister Beatrice's breathing remained steady, though Adela knew her companion was no more at peace than she was. The plan had been whispered in pieces, stitched together through fleeting exchanges and covert nods beneath the unblinking eyes of the abbess's enforcers. A meeting beneath the oldest cypress in the lower cloister, where the earth had begun to split and the roots stretched like skeletal fingers toward the convent's deepest foundations. When the midnight bell called the sisters to nocturnes, Adela rose with the others, her limbs heavy but her resolve sharpened by the cold sting of the floor beneath her feet. The familiar march to the chapel commenced, their collective chanting rising into the rafters, while the stone saints looked on with silent indifference. Yet tonight, Adela's voice was hollow, the sacred words falling from her tongue without conviction. Her heart thudded beneath her ribs, counting the moments until the hourglass turned. When the final hymn drifted into silence, and the sisters were released back into the frigid halls, Adela slipped away with practiced ease, her footsteps swallowed by the age-old stones beneath her. The lower cloister was deathly still, save for the soughing wind rattling the shutters. Beneath the great cypress, 3 figures had already gathered, their faces half shrouded by the flickering light of a smuggled tallow candle. Sister Beatrice stood tall among them, her jaw clenched, her eyes burning with unspoken defiance. "Sister." Magdalene's words were clear, Beatrice whispered, passing the parchment into Adela's waiting hands. "The abbess's cruelty has defiled this place, turned sacred halls into tombs. The order from Father Clement is to remove anyone who questions her authority under false charges of heresy. Felice and Honora, they never reached the abbey. In Wrentham, they were taken to the woods and left there." Adela's throat tightened as she scanned the hurried script, Magdalene's unmistakable hand. Each letter a cry from the grave. The list of names included many they had known, sisters who had vanished without a trace, swallowed by a system that masked tyranny in the cloak of piety. "We cannot remain silent," Beatrice continued, her voice a thread of steel woven through. "The fear, if we do, we will be next." The other sisters nodded, their expressions carved from the same grim determination. Sister Helen, who had once feared her own shadow, now stood unflinching, fingers curled into fists. Sister Alice, soft-spoken but fierce beneath the surface, murmured a prayer of protection beneath her breath. Adela folded the parchment carefully, her hands steadier than she expected. "Then we move before the feast of St. Crispin," she whispered, voice steady. "Before the next visitors arrive and the abbess tightens her grip. There is a way through the old cloister walls. Sister Magdalene marked it here." The flickering candlelight danced over the worn faces, a fragile glow amid the encroaching dark. Hope was a dangerous thing within these walls, fragile enough to be extinguished in a heartbeat. But tonight it burned brighter than it had in years. The wind outside roared louder, battering against the wooden shutters, as though the convent itself recoiled from the secrets now laid bare. The bells of Saint Ethelreda rang once more, their metallic clang sinking into the bones of the cloister. But within the hearts of the gathered sisters, a different sound stirred a pulse, a rhythm not dictated by the rigid hours of prayer, but by the long-silenced voices of justice and freedom. The tolling echoed in the distance, but their resolve remained close and unshaken. Far above, in the abbess's chamber, candlelight guttered behind thick curtains as eyes narrowed in suspicion, brood. Shadows shifted beyond sight. Ancient alliances whispered on the edge of hearing. The abbess's grip was iron, but even iron could crack beneath enough pressure. As the sisters dispersed beneath the cypress, Adela felt the wind swirl against her cheeks, carrying with it the first whispers of dawn. Their time was coming. Their moment was approaching. The days of silent suffering would not stretch unbroken forever, and when the next bell rang, it would ring not only for obedience, but for reckoning. The hush of early morning settled upon Saint Ethelreda like a heavy shroud. The bells had rung their dawn greeting, calling the sisters to prime, yet the halls felt strangely hollow, as if the air itself recoiled from the weight of secrets now, stirring beneath the ancient arches. Sister Adela moved among her fellow nuns, the rhythm of prayer woven into every step, but beneath her woolen habit, her pulse whispered a different song. The conspiracy, once mere fragile murmurs behind closed doors, had now taken root, spreading like ivy through the cracks of the cloister's crumbling foundations. Words written by Sister Magdalene, hidden away in the cold earth beneath the chapel, had fanned the smoldering embers of defiance into a cautious, steady flame, and Adela could feel its heat warming her spirit, even as the cold stones pressed against her bare feet. Today was not like the others. There was a restlessness beneath the quiet order of the day, a subtle shifting of eyes, a stiffness in bowed heads. Sister Beatrice worked beside her in the scriptorium, her hand steady as she copied lines of sacred scripture. But her glances toward the narrow window were frequent. Her fingers tensed around the worn quill. The scriptorium was a place of toil, a chamber where thought was limited to transcribing ancient prayers and scripture onto brittle parchment. Yet now it had become their refuge, their workshop of quiet resistance. Adela carefully unrolled the fresh parchment she had managed to claim from the abbess's steward, disguising her true task beneath lines of Latin that would go unnoticed by any casual observer. She copied the expected passages diligently, but beneath the prescribed ink strokes, coded markings took shape subtle patterns only the informed could decipher. Instructions, warnings, and signals for the sisters who had gathered under the great cypress, each page destined not for the convent library, but for hidden corners of Saint Ethelreda, where they could not be easily erased. Outside, winter pressed closer. The sky above the high cloister windows remained a dull gray, clouds pregnant with snow that threatened to trap the sisters within these walls for weeks. Adela wondered if the coming storm was a curse or a blessing, whether it would shield them from discovery or suffocate their growing hope before it could blossom. By midday, the convent fell into its familiar rhythm. The sisters gathered for terce, their chanting rising weakly into the cold chapel air, their breath forming misty trails that curled and vanished beneath the stone vaults. Adela's voice joined theirs, though her heart lingered far away beneath the cypress, where Sister Beatrice and Sister Alice waited for her after prayer. When the final amen drifted into silence, Adela filed out with the others, head bowed, steps measured. Yet, as they turned toward the cloister gardens, she slipped quietly down a side corridor, footsteps muffled by worn rushes on the floor. The corridor twisted like a snake beneath the chapel, leading to the ancient storerooms where unused tools, gathered dust and forgotten relics waited for time to consume them. It was here, in the shadows beyond the storerooms, that Adela found them, Beatrice standing tall, Alice crouched by a loose floor tile, prying it open with a stolen chisel. Sister Helen arrived moments later, cheeks flushed from the cold, her habit damped from the biting wind. "This is where Magdalene left the map," Beatrice whispered, her voice as thin as the draft curling through the cracks in the wall. "The old servants' passage, beneath the convent kitchens." Adela dropped to her knees, brushing away dust and debris, fingers tracing the crude map etched into the flat underside of the tile. Lines, symbols, small notations in hurried Latin, an escape route, hidden in plain sight, buried beneath years of forgetfulness and indifference. Hope flared in her chest, but caution quickly smothered it. They were not yet free. The passage had not been used in decades, and no one knew if it remained passable or whether it had collapsed into rubble. Like so many other forgotten parts of Saint Ethelreda, the abbess has noticed something, Alice warned, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Father Clement lingers longer in the halls, and Sister Laurentine watches our every step. She feels something shifting. Adela nodded grimly. Their movements had not gone unseen. The abbess was no fool. Her authority had been forged in decades of ruthless governance. She would sense the unrest curling through her convent like smoke from a hidden fire. If they waited too long, suspicion would crystallize into action, and escape would become impossible. "We act at matins," Adela whispered, determination tightening her voice. "Tomorrow night, one final day to prepare. Then we follow the path Magdalene carved for us, out of these cursed walls." No one argued. The weight of their shared suffering pressed too heavily upon them to allow hesitation. One by one, they slipped away, returning to their tasks, with heads bowed and hearts hammering against their ribs. Adela moved through the rest of the day as if in a dream. She tended the kitchen gardens, her fingers stiff from the frost, whispering parting words to the cold earth that had known her tears and her sweat. She walked the cloisters, pressing fingertips to ancient walls that had borne witness to her youth crumbling into submission. When the bell called them to vespers, she sang with the others, the sacred words laced with quiet defiance. When the evening meal was served, she choked down the hard bread and thin gruel, savoring it for the first time not as sustenance, but as the final taste of a life she was determined to abandon. Night fell heavy upon Saint Ethel, the wind screaming against the walls like lost souls begging for release. Adela lay upon her cot, eyes wide, heart restless. Around her, the sisters slumbered fitfully, bodies worn from years of penance, minds dulled by endless routine. But she remained awake, every nerve alight with anticipation. The morning came too soon, the tolling bell dragging them into wakefulness for lauds. Snow drifted through the cloister garden, blanketing the earth in white purity, mocking the grime and suffering trapped within the convent's walls. Adela moved through her final day of labor with care. She performed each task as expected, recited each prayer with practiced ease, allowing no sign of rebellion to pierce her faculty. But beneath the surface, the storm gathered strength, swirling in her chest like a coiled serpent waiting to strike. When the time came for Compline, the last prayer before nightfall, she joined her sisters in the chapel, kneeling beneath the cold gaze of the saints. She listened to the abbess's voice as it led them through the Psalms, each word sharper than a blade, each commandment a link in the chain that bound them. But chains could be broken. Even iron could bend beneath enough pressure. As they filed from the chapel, Sister Laurentine's eyes lingered on Adela, suspicion darkening her gaze. Father Clement stood near the chapel doors, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. Adela's stomach twisted, but she kept her stride even, her face carved from the same unfeeling stone that surrounded them. Night settled thick and silent. When the midnight bell rang for matins, Adela rose once more, heart drumming like a war call beneath her ribs. She joined the silent procession toward the chapel, her breath rising in pale clouds beneath her veil. But this time, when the chant began, Adela's voice did not join. Her lips remained still, her eyes sharp as they counted, each sister gathered in the dim candlelight. The moment the abbess's head bowed, Adela slipped from the rear stall, disappearing into the shadows as easily as a whisper in the wind. She moved quickly through the twisting corridors, feet bare, steps silent. Each turn of the stone halls burned into her memory. Beneath the kitchens, the hidden passage awaited, its ancient threshold gaping like the mouth of a sleeping beast. Sister Beatrice arrived seconds later, followed by Alice and Helen, their faces pale, but their eyes burning with desperate resolve. The sisters gathered, breath quick and uneven, hearts thrumming in harmony. The time had come to reclaim their freedom, to chase the fragments of life stolen from them. Beneath the iron rule of the abbess, Adela reached for the hidden latch Sister Magdalene's map had described, her fingers trembling as they pressed into the groove carved centuries ago. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a soft groan of protest, the hidden door shifted. The path lay open before them, dark, cold, and unknown. But freedom rarely comes dressed in comfort. Adela took the first step into the shadows, the chill curling around her ankles like a final warning. Behind her, the ancient walls stood silent, the saints staring in their unblinking judgment. Ahead of her, the tunnel beckoned a passage carved by forgotten hands, leading to a fate unpromised but utterly their own. The bells rang again in the distance, the sound muffled beneath layers of stone, and the sisters of Saint Ethelreda slipped beneath the earth, chasing the sliver of light that danced far beyond the reach of cloistered chains. The darkness of the old servant's passage swallowed the sisters whole, a suffocating tunnel pressing in with every step, its air stale with centuries of neglect. The flickering light of a single tallow candle, gripped tightly in Sister Beatrice's hand, pushed back the blackness just enough for their feet to find the uneven stones beneath. Behind them, the faint tolling of the cloister bells faded into memory. And ahead stretched the unknown damp, silent and unforgiving. Adela led the way, her fingers trailing the cold, crumbling walls, counting each turn and step, as Sister Markings had described. The walls pressed close, the ceiling low enough that even the smallest among them stooped to pass. The air grew colder, thick with moisture that dripped in slow, steady beats, a rhythm as ancient as the stones themselves. For a brief while, their footsteps were the only sound, quiet scuffs of bare soles against rough stone, the occasional scrape of habit cloth catching on jagged edges. Each breath came shallow, muffled by the oppressive damp. But beneath the surface silence, Adela could hear something older, a hum within the walls, a distant memory of life that once moved freely. Through these forgotten tunnels, are you certain this will lead us beyond the cloister walls? Whispered Alice, her voice thin and raw from holding back fear. Adela nodded, not daring to stop her forward momentum. The markings are clear, she whispered. Sister Magdalene found the path before they silenced her. Behind them, Helen muttered a quiet prayer, her fingers tracing the small wooden cross hidden beneath her robes. Beatrice's jaw was set in grim determination, the faint glow of the candle lighting her eyes with a fire that no discipline could extinguish. The passage narrowed, forcing them to walk single file, shoulders scraping against the stone. The damp floor grew slick beneath their feet, and twice Adela stumbled, palms grazing the rough walls to catch herself. Time lost meaning as they pressed forward, step after cautious step, deeper into the belly of Saint Ethelreda. At last, the passage widened slightly, opening into a small hollow chamber where remnants of the past lingered, rotting crates, broken iron tools, fragments of clay jugs shattered long ago. Beatrice rested the candle atop an overturned barrel, its light dancing over the low-arched ceiling. "This must be the old storeroom," Adela whispered, consulting the folded parchment pressed to her chest. "From here, we turn north. There should be a narrow corridor leading to the water shaft." Alice crouched by a pile of discarded bones in the corner, her fingers ghosting over the brittle remains of a long-dead rat. "No one has been here in decades," she whispered. "Perhaps longer." Helen pulled her cloak tighter around her, glancing back toward the narrow tunnel from which they had emerged. "And if the way is blocked?" Her question trembled in the still air, but Adela did not allow the fear to settle. "Then we clear it," Adela answered, voice steadier than she felt. "One stone at a time if we must." With no time to lose, they pressed onward. The northward corridor was even narrower, its floor uneven, slanting downward at a perilous angle. The air grew heavier, saturated with the scent of damp earth and mildew. Beatrice's candle guttered in the draught, its flame shrinking, threatening to abandon them to the complete blackness of the underground. "We must ration the light," Beatrice whispered, shielding the flame with her hand. "We cannot risk being trapped in total dark," Adela agreed, with a nod, her hand brushing the rough markings etched into the wall arrows carved by Sister Magdalene herself, pointing the way through the labyrinth of tunnels. The knowledge that Magdalene had walked these same corridors before her filled Adela with a quiet strength, as though the lost sister's presence lingered among them, guiding their weary steps. Minutes stretched into hours. Their legs ached from crouching, muscles burning from the constant tension of navigating the tight, unyielding path. Yet they pressed forward, driven by the flickering hope of freedom, by the knowledge that beyond these ancient walls lay a world that had long been denied to them. When the sound of trickling water reached their ears, it was like a balm to their frayed spirits. Adela quickened her pace, following the increasing drip-drip that echoed through the stones. At last, the tunnel opened into a broader shaft where a narrow stream ran along a shallow channel cut into the rock. A forgotten vein of life beneath. "The cloister, this is it," Adela breathed, hope swelling in her chest. "The water shaft leads beneath the outer wall, and out." Alice dropped to her knees beside the stream, cupping her hands to drink the cold, metallic-tasting water. Helen crouched beside her, letting the coolness soothe her dry throat, while Beatrice inspected the far wall, where a rusted iron grate blocked their path. "It's old," Beatrice murmured, testing the bars with both hands. "We can break through it." Adela reached into the folds of her habit, pulling out a worn iron chisel stolen from the convent's repair chamber. "Then we do it quickly," she whispered. "Before the bells ring for lauds, before they notice we are gone." Beatrice took the chisel with a determined nod, setting to work on the crumbling iron with slow, deliberate strikes. The sound echoed unnervingly through the chamber, but the sisters worked in grim silence, muscles straining, sweat beading on their brows despite the chill. Minutes passed in aching slowness, and then that last low groan reverberated through the stone as the rusted iron gave way. With a final pull, Beatrice dislodged the grate, revealing a narrow crawlspace beyond, a channel carved by the ancient stream that trickled toward the freedom beyond the convent walls. One by one, they slid through the opening, crawling upon hands and knees, wading through the cold stream that bit at their skin and soaked their robes. The crawlspace pressed close, the ceiling so low it brushed their backs, the darkness nearly absolute beyond the reach of their dying candlelight. Yet they did not hesitate, not when the fear clawed at their hearts, nor when the stones scraped at their skin, nor when their limbs threatened collapse. Because beyond this final stretch of suffocating blackness lay the promise of sky, of air untouched by cloister chains, of a world that had forgotten them, but that they would reclaim. Adela felt the earth slant upward beneath her palms, the walls widening ever so slightly, the dampness giving way to fresher air that stirred faintly against her cheeks. "We're close," she whispered, her voice trembling between exhaustion and hope. The others pressed forward, silent and determined, when the faintest sliver of moonlight appeared, ahead, a thin, pale line breaking through the ancient stone. The sisters' hearts surged in unison. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was there, just beyond the final barrier of stone and fear. With renewed strength, they scrambled forward, fingers clawing at loose earth, bodies aching, but souls alight, and then the tunnel broke open, spilling them into the embrace of the open night. Beneath a sky heavy with clouds but wondrously vast, the stars barely peeking through the shroud, Adela tumbled into the grass, the earth soft beneath her palms, the wind biting at her cheeks. And for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to weep, not for sorrow, but for the raw, staggering sensation of freedom, of air untainted by incense and stone. Beatrice emerged beside her, gasping for breath, her eyes wide as they stared toward the distant tree line. Alice and Helen followed, collapsing onto the frost-touched ground, their faces streaked with sweat and mud, but alight with quiet triumph. We made it," Alice whispered, her voice cracking. Adela nodded, wiping her damp cheeks with a trembling hand. "We're beyond the walls. We're free." But the night was not finished with them yet. Behind them, faint and distant, the bells of Saint Ethelreda began to toll, their echo rising through the air like the howl of a distant beast sensing its prey slipping away. Adela's breath caught in her chest. "They'll know we're gone by lots," Beatrice warned, already rising to her feet, gaze scanning the darkness. "They'll send Clement, and the abbess will not let this go unanswered." Adela stood, her legs weak but her spirit stronger than it had ever been. "And we do not wait to be found. We go now. Far from these cursed walls. To the north, dense woods stretched like an ocean of blackness, uncharted and wild. But it welcomed them. Behind, the cloister bells screamed their fury. Ahead, the night beckoned, terrifying and beautiful. Adela took the first step, leading her sisters into the unknown, away from chains and cruelty, toward a life yet unwritten. And in the silence of the sleeping world, they vanished into the wilderness, forgotten no longer. The wind howled through the trees like a restless spirit, bending the brittle branches and sending flurries of snow spinning into the darkness. Adela pressed forward beneath the skeletal canopy, her cloak clinging damply to her skin, her steps heavy but steady. Behind her, Beatrice, Alice, and Helen moved in silence, their breaths ragged, their eyes wide with the thrill of escape and the weight of uncertainty. Saint Ethelreda lay far behind them now, its ancient towers swallowed by the shadows of the woods. The iron bell that had ruled there every hour was no longer audible, replaced by the quiet rustling of leaves and the low groan of distant boughs swaying in the wind. Yet the memory of that bell clung to them like a phantom, each toll echoing, in their minds, a grim reminder of what waited should they be caught. Adela glanced skyward. Though the clouds hid the moon and stars, the path before them was nothing more than a narrow clearing, hemmed in by thick undergrowth and the occasional twisted oak. The forest was ancient, perhaps even older than the convent itself. Whispers of forgotten pilgrims and wayward travelers seemed to linger in the soil, in the gnarled roots that threatened to trip them, in the cold breath of winter that chased them deeper into its labyrinth. "We must keep moving," Adela murmured, her voice low, steadying her own resolve. "If we rest too long, the cold will steal our strength." Beatrice nodded grimly, tightening the knot of her cloak. "And we are not far enough. They will search the roads first, then the fields. But by tomorrow, they will come to the woods." Alice wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "Where will we go? There are no towns nearby, only forests and wild things." "There is a village beyond the ridge," Helen offered quietly, her voice trembling from both exhaustion and hope. "A place called Morley. The pilgrims spoke of it when they passed through Saint Ethelreda. It lies beyond the old Roman road." Adela's mind grasped onto the fragile thread of possibility. Morley, a name, a direction, a place beyond the cloister, walls where life might still breathe, where the chains of the abbess could not reach. "Then that is where we will go," Adela decided. "We'll follow the ridge north until we find the road." The snow began to fall in earnest, swirling in thick curtains around them, clinging to hair and fabric, muting their footsteps. They trudged on through the underbrush, over roots and fallen branches, around dense patches of bramble that snagged at their skirts. The forest closed in tighter with each step, an ancient thing observing their trespass with cold indifference. Hours passed. The night deepened. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, but they pressed on, knowing that to stop was to surrender. By the time the first dull glow of dawn touched the sky, they had reached the foot of the ridge. The slope was steep, the path barely discernible beneath. A fresh blanket of snow, but Adela felt a surge of grim determination. "We climb," she said simply. One by one they ascended, hands gripping roots and jagged rocks, muscles screaming in protest. Their limbs trembled from exertion and cold, but not one among them complained. Above, the clouds thinned, allowing faint shafts of pale light to filter through the canopy. When they finally crested the ridge, the sisters collapsed against the snow-dusted stones, chests heaving, hearts pounding. Below them stretched a vast expanse of wilderness, broken only by the faint line of a forgotten road, winding eastward, toward unseen lands. "There," Beatrice whispered, pointing. "The old road, just as Magdalene's writings said." Adela's chest swelled with cautious hope. They had come farther than any had thought possible. The cloister bells were distant memories now. The suffocating walls replaced by open sky and the promise of freedom. But survival was not assured. Adela stood, brushing snow from her cloak, forcing her weary limbs to obey. "We follow the road east until we find Morley. No fires, no markings. We stay hidden until we are beyond the abbess's reach." The others rose beside her, exhaustion carved into their faces but tempered by determination. They had faced worse. Within the cloister walls, endless hunger, cold, cruelty, and despair. Out here, at least the air was their own, and the choices belonged to them. They descended from the ridge slowly, carefully, muscles aching with every step. The road below was overgrown and uneven, flanked by skeletal trees and the remnants of forgotten milestones, marking distances to towns that no longer existed. By midday, the snow lessened, the clouds lifting just enough to reveal a leaden winter. Sky hunger gnawed cruelly at their insides, but there was little to be done. They searched the frozen ground for wild herbs or roots, but the earth yielded little beneath its icy covering. When they came upon a small stream, the sisters paused, to drink deeply, cupping their hands in the frigid water. Adela's lips stung from the cold, but the liquid refreshed her spirit, if only briefly. "We will need shelter before nightfall," Beatrice murmured, scanning the dense woods that flanked the road. Adela nodded. "An outcropping, a cave. Anything to shield us from the wind." Helen pointed toward the east. "The land slopes again. There may be shelter near the valley floor." The day dragged on, each step heavier than the last. Fatigue threatened to steal their resolve, but Adela pressed them forward, whispering quiet encouragement, remembering the countless nights spent under the abbess's unrelenting gaze. Every hour of suffering beyond the cloister was a small victory, every breath a quiet rebellion. By late afternoon, they found their refuge a narrow cleft in a rocky hill, hidden beneath a thick copse of pine. The opening was small, but deep enough to shield them from the wind. Its interior dry, its stone walls offering a crude comfort. With branches gathered from nearby, they created a crude barrier against the cold, huddling together beneath their threadbare cloaks. Their stomachs remained empty, their bodies weak, but their spirits burned bright beneath the ash of exhaustion. That night, as darkness fell once more, Adela allowed herself a moment of stillness, her gaze fixed on the sliver of sky visible through the pines. "We survived the first night," Alice whispered, her voice fragile but full of wonder. Adela nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "And we will survive the next, and the next, until Saint Ethelreda is nothing but a distant memory." The wind whistled softly through the trees, and though the cold pressed in from all sides, it was a kinder companion than the abbess's wrath. They slept in shifts, the night long and restless, but filled with the quiet comfort of knowing that they had chosen this hardship, that the chains no longer bound their wrists, that their suffering had purpose now, shaped by their own hands. When dawn broke again, pale and reluctant, the sisters rose with it, stiff and aching but determined. The road stretched on before them, winding through the hills like a serpent of forgotten dreams. With every step, they left behind the cloister walls, the cruel discipline, the suffocating silence. With every breath they reclaimed their humanity, and, in the quiet rhythm of their footsteps, beneath the sheltering trees, the lost daughters of Saint Ethelreda carved a new path through the wilderness, forging a future as uncertain as it was free. The winter dawn stretched weakly across the sky, a dull gray curtain that offered little warmth, but marked the beginning of another day in the world beyond the cloister walls. Beneath the sheltering canopy of ancient pines, Adela stirred from a restless sleep, her limbs stiff, her bones aching from the hard stone beneath. Around her, the other sisters shifted in silence, their faces pale, their eyes red-rimmed from cold and hunger, but their hearts still holding the fragile thread of hope. The stream nearby gurgled softly, its icy waters continuing their timeless journey through the valley. The wind creaked the pine boughs overhead, sending down gentle cascades of snowflakes that dusted their cloaks and hair. Adela stood, shaking off the remnants of sleep, drawing her cloak tighter about her thin frame. "Today, we reach Morley," she said quietly, her voice carrying the promise of shelter, of food, of warmth. Beatrice was the first to rise, her fingers already checking the straps of the small satchel that carried their only possessions, Magdalene's map, a dull knife, and the folded parchment upon which Adela had traced every secret of their escape. Her breath was steady, her gaze determined. "We are stronger than they thought," Beatrice said, her words simple but fierce. Helen stood next, rubbing her hands together to chase away the cold that seemed to live beneath her skin. Alice remained, seated a moment longer, staring at the pale morning sky, before drawing in a deep breath and rising. She brushed snow from her sleeves and gave Adela a quiet nod, with no food to break their fast. They drank from the stream, the cold water biting, but refreshing, and continued eastward along the forgotten Roman road. The path curved through the valley, rising and falling like the back of some ancient slumbering beast. Snow clung stubbornly to the ground, but the faint outlines of the road remained visible beneath patches of frost and earth as they walked. The forest seemed to shift around them, sometimes dense and claustrophobic, other times opening into wide barren stretches where wind swept across the hills with biting ferocity. They moved in silence, speaking only when necessary, conserving their strength in their voices. The world out here spoke in whispers, creaking trees, distant bird calls, the soft crunch of snow beneath weary feet. By mid-morning they crested a low rise and paused to catch their breath. Before them, the land dipped into a shallow basin where the remains of a crumbling stone marker stood tilted in the snow. Time had worn away the carvings, but Adela recognized its purpose. "The boundary marker," she whispered. "The edge of the cloister's old holdings. Beyond this, the free world." The words felt strange upon her tongue. Free world, a place she had only ever heard, spoken of in cautionary tones within the convent walls. A world deemed dangerous, sinful, uncontrollable. But standing there, the wind tugging at her cloak, the sky stretching wide above, Adela felt no fear of it, only the cautious excitement of what lay beyond. They pressed on, the road descending into a narrow ravine where the trees closed in once more. Here, the air was damp and heavy, the ground slick beneath their feet. Ice clung to the edges of the stream that wove alongside the path, and every step required care. It was Alice who first noticed the tracks' faint impressions in the snow, half-melted, but unmistakably human. "Someone passed through here," she said, her voice low. Adela crouched beside the tracks, studying their depth and direction. They pointed east, leading the same way the sisters traveled. Her heart quickened not in fear, but with the realization that civilization lay near. Travelers meant roads, roads meant villages, and villages meant Morley could not be far. Not long ago, Beatrice noted, crouching beside Adela. Perhaps yesterday. Adela stood, glancing toward the narrowing path ahead. "We keep moving." The ravine twisted like a serpent through the hills, and the day wore on in a slow rhythm of cautious steps and quickened hearts. By afternoon, the clouds gathered once more, thick and low, promising another bout of snow before dusk. Adela urged them forward, unwilling to be caught in the open beneath heavy skies. When they reached the mouth of the ravine, the landscape shifted again. Rolling hills stretched ahead, dotted with barren trees and low shrubs poking through the snow. A ribbon of smoke curled in the distance, faint against the steel-gray sky. "Look," Helen breathed, pointing smoke. From a chimney. Adela's heart leaped, though caution quickly followed. Civilization was close, but so too was danger. They were runaway sisters, and the abbess's reach extended far. Their appearance-worn habits, thin faces, hollow eyes would betray them at a glance. "We cannot approach the village openly," Adela warned. "Not until we are certain it is safe." They veered from the road, taking to the hills, moving swiftly and silently through the uneven terrain. The smoke became clearer as they crested another rise, revealing a small collection of thatched rooftops huddled beside a frozen stream, or so they hoped. From their vantage point, they could see a low stone church standing at the village's heart, its bell tower, squat and old. Smoke rose from chimneys, and faint figures moved between cottages, their forms small and distant beneath the heavy sky. "There are people," Alice whispered, her hunger making her voice tremble. "Food, warmth." Adela's stomach twisted painfully at the thought, but caution anchored her resolve. "We watch until dark," she said firmly. "Then we decide." They circled wide around the village, finding a patch of bramble near the ridge where they could observe without being seen. Beneath the tangled branches, they waited, huddled close for warmth, eyes fixed on the quiet life unfolding below. Children darted between homes, bundled in woolen cloaks, their laughter muffled by distance. A farmer led his oxen to the edge of the stream, breaking ice to reach the water. A woman carried firewood into her cottage, her red skirts bright against the snow. It was life, simple and ordinary, so unlike the cold, rigid world they had fled. As dusk approached, a bell tolled from the church, calling the villagers to evening prayer. Figures moved toward the small stone chapel, their heads bowed, their steps unhurried. Adela watched them go, her heart a storm of emotions. Would the villagers offer shelter, or would they return them to the abbess's grasp? "We can try the church," Beatrice whispered. "Priests offer sanctuary." "Some do," Adela replied quietly. "Others serve those in power." Night fell slowly, the sky deepening into purple, then black, while the snow began once more. Soft flakes drifting down from the clouds. Lights flickered in the village windows, warm and inviting. Adela drew a slow breath. "We go in pairs," she decided. "Alice and I will approach first. Helen, Beatrice wait by the ridge. If we do not return by morning, go east. Follow the stream." The sisters nodded, the weight of trust heavy between them. With quiet steps, Adela and Alice descended into the valley, the snow muffling their approach, their hearts steady, despite the unknown that awaited beyond the cloister walls. Their story was only beginning. Snowflakes drifted silently through the still night air as Adela and Alice moved down the slope, their forms small against the expanse of white fields. The village of Morley lay before them, its rooftops sagging under the weight of winter, narrow paths winding between crooked cottages, smoke curling in lazy threads from chimneys into the dark sky. Each step toward the cluster of homes brought a quiet swell of hope and dread. Alice, walking a pace behind, kept her gaze low, her hands hidden within the folds of her tattered cloak. Adela led without hesitation, though her heart pounded heavy in her chest. They had left the suffocating chains of the cloister behind, but out here, the unknown pressed close on all sides. The stream that bordered the village babbled quietly beneath a crust of ice. They crossed where the bank dipped low, skirts brushing the frozen reeds, boots slipping on the frost-slick stones. Beyond the stream, the path narrowed, curling toward the first cottages where lanterns glowed faintly behind shuttered windows. Adela slowed, placing a steadying hand on Alice's wrist. "We ask for the priest," she whispered. "His duty is to God before the abbess." Alice nodded, though her lips trembled in the cold. The two sisters moved forward, following the muddy track to the church that stood like a silent sentinel. At the heart of Morley, the stone structure was small, its walls rough-hewn and weathered by time. The wooden door was unlatched, left ajar, swaying softly with the wind's gentle push. Warm light spilled from within, flickering through the narrow slits of its arched windows. Adela paused, pressing her palm against the ancient wood, listening. Muffled voices drifted from inside simple prayers, the rhythmic hum of hymns, the settling of bodies into pews. Alice stood beside her, eyes wide, her breath misting the air. With a final glance toward the sleeping cottages, Adela pushed the door open. The interior of the church was plain and humble. Rough timber beams stretched across the low ceiling, and candles lined the altar, their flames dancing against the worn stone walls. A small congregation knelt in prayer, their heads bowed, their voices murmuring the evening psalms. At the front stood a man in modest robes, his back to them as he recited the final blessing. His hair was streaked with gray, his posture upright but softened by age. His voice carried no grandeur, only the calm certainty of practiced ritual. Adela and Alice stepped inside, their entrance drawing only the faintest creak from the heavy door. A few villagers glanced over their shoulders, their expressions flickering from curiosity to quiet surprise at the sight of two cloaked figures standing at the threshold. The priest concluded his prayer, his hands raised, then slowly turned. His gaze landed upon Adela first, then Alice, his lined face settling into a look of tempered concern rather than alarm. He nodded once, subtly, and addressed the gathered villagers. "Go in peace," he said simply, and with the soft rustle of wool and leather, the villagers rose and made their way out into the night. Adela and Alice stood motionless, waiting until the last of the congregation had left. Only then did the priest step forward, stopping a few paces from them. "You are not from here," he said, in a voice as steady as stone, "and you do not come in comfort." Adela lowered her hood, revealing her pale, wind-chapped face, her hair damp from snow, her eyes ringed with fatigue. "We are sisters, from Saint Ethelreda," she said quietly. "We have left the cloister." The priest's brow tightened, though his gaze did not harden. "No one leaves Saint Ethelreda," he murmured. "Not without cost." Alice's voice cracked as she spoke. We could no longer endure it." Silence settled between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the candles. The priest motioned them forward. "Come to the sacristy," he said, turning toward a side door near the altar. "You will freeze, standing there." They followed him through a narrow passage, the scent of beeswax and incense lingering in the air. The sacristy was warmer, a small room lined with shelves of missals and vestments. A single brazier burned in the corner, offering meager heat. The priest gestured to a wooden bench. "Sit, rest your bones." Adela and Alice obeyed, their limbs grateful for the reprieve. "I am Father Jocelyn." The priest introduced himself as he settled onto a stool nearby. His gaze remained calm but watchful. "Morley is small. News travels fast. Who else knows of your coming?" "No one," Adela answered firmly. "We left at dusk, 2 nights past. Our sisters wait beyond the ridge, hidden until we know it is safe." Father Jocelyn exhaled, folding his hands in his lap. "And the abbess? She will have discovered our absence by now," Adela admitted, "but she will expect us to take the western road, to run toward the cities, not the hills." Jocelyn's gaze lingered on the two women, weighing their words, their worn appearance, the desperation in their posture. Slowly he stood, moving to a small chest, where he withdrew a crust of bread and a wedge of dried cheese. "Eat," he said simply. Placing the food before them, Alice's hands trembled as she reached for the bread, her gratitude unspoken but profound. Jocelyn returned to his stool, his voice low. "Tomorrow, I will speak with the blacksmith and the miller's wife. They are good souls, quiet souls. They may offer you shelter until you can decide your path." Adela swallowed her meager mouthful, her throat tight. "You would risk this? For strangers?" Jocelyn's lips pressed into a thin smile. "The church teaches mercy, though some within its walls forget it." Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the sacristy, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in many days, the cold seemed to loosen its grip. Jocelyn leaned forward, his expression serious. "Tonight, you will rest in the loft above the church. I will lock the doors at midnight. No one will disturb you." Adela bowed her head, gratitude washing over her like warmth from the brazier. "Thank you, Father." His voice softened. "Rest now, for morning will come quickly, and with it, decisions must be made." As the candles guttered low, Adela and Alice followed him to the narrow stairs leading to the loft above the nave. It was simple rough wooden boards, a thin pallet, a woolen blanket, but it was safe. Beneath them, the church sighed with the sounds of settling timber and whispering wind, and beyond its walls, the quiet village of Morley slept, unaware of the storm stirring beyond its borders. Adela lay down beside Alice, her body easing into the rough comfort. For the first time, her heart slowed, her breath deepened, and as the last candle flickered out, she allowed her heavy eyelids to close. Tomorrow would come, but tonight they were free. Night unraveled gently above the village of Morley, while beneath the old timber beams of the loft, Adela drifted between restless dreams and fleeting moments of calm. The distant toll of the bell tower stirred her only briefly, a sound far softer than the brutal clang that once ruled her every waking moment inside the convent walls. Around her, Alice slept, her breath steady, her form cocooned in the simple woolen blanket Father Jocelyn had provided. Below, the church stood silent, its stone heart cradling them in a fragile sanctuary. When dawn arrived, it did so reluctantly. Gray light filtered through the narrow slats in the wooden roof, and the muffled sounds of village life began to stir bellahooves, clattering across frozen paths. Doors groaning on their hinges, low voices rising in the morning chill. Adela opened her eyes and sat up slowly, feeling every ache and bruise along her limbs. The hunger that gnawed faintly, but more manageable than before. Alice stirred soon after. Stretching beneath the blanket, her face momentarily soft before the memories returned. She sat up, her hair falling messily about her face, and met Adela's steady gaze. They had survived another night. That was more than many could claim. The wooden steps creaked as they descended, cautious of the life that awaited them. The church remained empty, save for Father Jocelyn, already tending to the morning candles near the altar, his hands moving in practiced grace. The air was thick with the soft scent of tallow and incense, a gentler perfume than the suffocating clouds of sanctified smoke they had known in Saint Ethelreda. Jocelyn turned at their approach, his expression unchanged, calm, knowing, but edged with quiet determination. "There's bread warming by the hearth," he said simply, gesturing toward the modest sacristy, "and broth enough for two." Adela's gratitude swelled quietly within her chest, too deep for words. She only nodded, guiding Alice toward the sacristy where warmth and food awaited. The simple meal eased their bellies, each mouthful a reminder of how much their bodies had endured, how close they had come to breaking when the last crust was eaten. Jocelyn joined them, settling on the opposite bench. "I have spoken with Edwin, the blacksmith," he said, his fingers lacing together, voice low. "He holds no love for the abbess, nor for the cloister's reach. His wife Marjorie lost a sister to Saint Ethelreda years ago, one who never returned." Adela's jaw tightened, the familiar ache of injustice pressing against her ribs. "They will hide you," Jocelyn continued, "only for a short while, until the search cools." Alice's brow furrowed, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "What if they come to the village?" Jocelyn's voice did not waver. "You will not be here by then." He unfolded a map, smaller and more worn than the one Magdalene had provided, but marked with the sharp ink lines of local knowledge. His finger traced the river that curved eastward, beyond Morley, toward hills and woodlands. There are woodsmen's cabins scattered along the river's bend, places where no steward travels, where tithe collectors do not roam. Stay off the main roads, follow the water's edge. With care, you will reach the edge of the bishop's lands within a fortnight. Adela leaned forward, studying the path with sharp eyes, memorizing each bend, each marker, and after, she asked softly. Jocelyn exhaled, his shoulders lowering. "South of the river lies Fenhold, old lands reclaimed by those seeking lives far from the church's shadow. Fishermen, dyers, craftsmen, people who ask no questions and care little. For old vows." Alice's hand gripped Adela's sleeve, her voice a whisper. "A place to begin again." Jocelyn nodded. "Perhaps. It is not safety forever, but it is freedom for now." Silence lingered, heavy but not unwelcome. They understood the stakes. Every step forward was stolen from the abbess's grip. Every sunrise, a quiet rebellion. Jocelyn rose, his chair scraping softly against the floor. Tonight, you will leave through the old orchard gate. Edwin will guide you past the village borders, then you must continue alone. Adela stood too, her voice steady. And her sisters? Jocelyn's gaze softened. We will bring them. At dusk, one journey at a time, child. The rest of the day unfolded with quiet efficiency. Jocelyn moved among the villagers, tending to minor tasks, raising no suspicion. Adela and Alice remained hidden within the church's walls, watching the village breathe and bustle through cracks in the wooden shutters. They heard the mill wheel groan along the stream, the blacksmith's hammer ring like distant thunder, the soft song of children playing in the lanes. This life was simple, worn but real, a stark contrast to the cold ritual of Saint Ethelreda. When evening descended, Jocelyn returned with cloaks bundled under his arms, thicker and warmer than the threadbare habits they wore. Alongside the cloaks came small satchels of bread, smoked fish, and dried apples, provisions enough to begin their journey. Just before the sky lost its final blush of light, Adela and Alice followed Jocelyn through the narrow passage at the rear of the church. The orchard gate creaked as it opened, revealing Edwin standing beyond, his broad shoulders wrapped in furs, a short blade tucked beneath his belt. Beside him, Marjorie stood tall, her jaw firm, a lantern swinging gently in her gloved hand. We'll see you to the far stones, Edwin said, without preamble. No tracks to the village. Adela's chest tightened. These people strangers risked everything for them, for justice they had no personal stake in. Her throat felt thick as she managed a quiet, "Thank you." Marjorie only nodded, her grip tightening on the lantern handle. No woman deserves chains in God's name. Beneath the thickening blanket of stars, they moved swiftly along hidden trails, avoiding the frozen roads, crossing fields crusted in snow where their footprints would vanish with the wind. The sisters gathered by the ridge, hidden in the trees, waiting like shadows in the hush of winter. Reunions were brief but heavy with relief. Silent embraces, tearful glances, hands grasped tightly beneath woolen cloaks. They did not linger, for the path stretched long ahead. Under Edwin and Marjorie's quiet guidance, they slipped from Morley's grasp, their figures swallowed by the dark folds of the valley. Behind them, the village faded into quietude, unaware of the small rebellion that had passed through its borders. When they reached the old standing stones, weathered sentinels marking ancient borders, Edwin stopped. "Beyond here, no tithman rides in winter," he said. "Keep to the river, no fires. Move at dawn and dusk." Marjorie pressed a bundle of dried rushes into Adela's hand. "For lighting when it's safe, you'll need it." Adela swallowed the thick lump in her throat. "If we live, we owe you everything." Marjorie's eyes softened. "You owe no one for surviving. Go." The lantern was shuttered, the final goodbyes exchanged without further words. Adela turned eastward, the river a silver serpent in the dark, the wind at their backs. With each step, the weight of the cloister loosened. The horizon stretched wider, and the promise of life raw, imperfect, free beckoned. Tomorrow's challenges would come soon enough, but tonight, beneath the wide sky, the sisters walked on, together. Dawn unfurled quietly over the frost-bitten hills, its pale light creeping across the tangled roots and quiet stream that guided the sisters eastward. The river moved with slow grace, its surface rippling beneath thin sheaths of ice that cracked and shifted under the gentle current. Adela walked ahead, her step steady, though her legs trembled from fatigue. Her cloak pulled tightly around her, to guard against the chill that clung to the earth. Behind her, Alice and the other sisters kept a quiet pace, no longer the bent, voiceless figures who had once shuffled through Saint Ethelreda's stone corridors. Each day had given them back a piece of themselves, stolen dignity, restored in fragments as they pressed further from the cloister's iron grasp. The land before them changed as the hours stretched onward. The neat fields of Morley gave way to tangled thickets and gnarled woods, to forgotten pathways and rocky outcroppings where moss crept over ancient stones. They moved through landscapes untouched by stewards, where no abbot's decree could reach where the only rhythm was that of the river and wind. For days they traveled with caution. At dawn they moved, their breath pluming in the cold, limbs stiff but determined. By midday, they found shelter among thickets or hollowed trees, resting as the winter sun passed overhead. At dusk, they moved again, silent travelers weaving between earth and water. Food was sparse, but the river gave enough small fish trapped in shallows, frozen berries clinging to bare branches. The bread from Morley dwindled, but hunger was now a quiet companion rather than a devouring master. Fatigue pressed heavily, but it did not crush them as before. Every step forward felt like a quiet act of reclamation. On the fourth day, the woods thinned, and the land opened into wide marshes, where the river split into meandering veins. Adela halted upon a ridge, her breath catching as her gaze stretched far into the lowlands. A distant wisp of smoke curled into the sky, where simple huts and wooden boats dotted the horizon. "Fenholt," she whispered. Alice stepped beside her, her lips parting in wonder. "We've reached it." Hope shimmered quietly between them. The name had been spoken in the dark halls of Saint Ethelreda as myth, a place whispered by novices who dreamed of escape. And now, it lay before them, real, raw, and waiting. The sisters descended from the ridge, crossing the final stretch of wild earth until they reached the winding lanes of Fenholt. Here, life moved slowly. Men patched nets along the muddy banks. Women tended to winter stores. Children darted between reed huts. No church bells rang. No abbess stood guard over their heads. As they entered the village, wary eyes turned toward them, measuring, questioning. Adela stepped forward, her voice steady but humble. "We seek refuge," she said simply. "We have fled Saint Ethelreda." A ripple moved through the gathered villagers, some whispers of curiosity, others of recognition. An older woman stepped forward, her weathered hands leaning on a driftwood cane. "You ran far," she said, her tone neither accusing nor welcoming. "Few ever make it this far." Adela did not hide the truth. "We could not survive there. We wish only to work, to live quietly." The woman's sharp eyes softened just slightly. "Here, we have no cloisters, no abbesses, only river and land. You take care of yourselves, you'll be left alone." Adela's throat tightened. She lowered her head in respect. "That is all we ask." Fenholt was no paradise, but it was freedom. They were given an abandoned hut near the marsh edge crooked, walls and a leaking roof, but shelter nonetheless. They patched it with reeds, mended it with their own hands, and in time, the bones of the house felt sturdier beneath their fingers. Alice learned to weave fish traps, her nimble hands tying knots, faster than the local boys. Beatrice bartered herbs, gathered from the woods, her knowledge once forced under Saint Ethelreda, now becoming her strength. Others cleaned fish, repaired boats, or helped gather reeds to patch thatched roofs. They worked without shame, their backs bowed from labor, not penance. Adela found herself tending to the sick, her memory recalling the healing balms and forgotten remedies Sister Magdalene had whispered about during cold cloister nights. Slowly, trust grew among the people of Fenholt. The sisters were no longer strangers, but women with faces, names, and skills the village could not do without. The seasons shifted. Winter's icy grip thawed into the muddy trails of spring. Flowers bloomed along the riverbanks, and children's laughter rang through the clearing. Adela stood at the water's edge one warm afternoon, her skirts damp from the tide, her hands scraping fish scales onto the earth. Beside her, Alice sang a quiet tune, no longer the hollow hum of a caged bird, but a song filled with soft life. When the church bells rang in the distant hills, they no longer flinched. When merchants passed through whispering rumors of Saint Ethelreda, of the abbess who searched for lost sisters, the women of Fenholt only smiled quietly and pressed on with their day. Months turned to years. The memories of stone corridors, of midnight punishments and cold penance grew softer, distant echoes rather than raw wounds. The sisters became women of Fenholt, known for their hard work, their quiet strength, their refusal to bend to old cruelties. Adela, once a novice kneeling in submission, now stood tall at the village council, her voice steady when decisions were made. Alice tended her own small reed garden by the marsh, her laughter freely shared with children who knew nothing of cloisters or a BBESSES. In time, even the sisters no longer counted days since their escape. Their lives became woven into the simple rhythm of river and soil, of survival without shame, of dignity without permission. And as years passed, the tale of their flight became a quiet story, told by old fishermen near crackling fires, not of broken women, but of strength, of escape, of life reclaimed. Far from the stone walls, beyond the reach of bells and cloisters, they had found the only salvation that mattered, the right to live, and in that quiet, enduring freedom, they were finally home.